5 minutes. That's the entire burglary test behind the word safe on the box holding your rifles. One person, hand tools, 5 minutes, and they're standing inside. That's not a typo. That's the standard. And the number printed right above that word, the fire rating that promises to pull those same rifles out of a house fire, was written by the company that sold you the box. Nobody outside that building ever checked it. 2 claims on 1 door, and both of them are doing work. The steel underneath was never built to do. I sold these things, years of them, off a retail floor the week before opening day, to guys carrying a truck payment's worth of rifles and a number in their head about what a safe was supposed to be. I read the spec sheets the customer never flips over, and I want to walk you through the 2 claims printed on the side of almost every gun safe in America. Not because these boxes are worthless, because they're not, but because the label is selling you a tier of protection the steel behind it was never built to reach. By the end, you'll be able to read one of these listings the way I read them, and you'll know exactly which line is doing the lying and what to buy instead. Here's the part nobody at the counter tells you, and it's the whole game once you see it. There is no law that says what a fire rating on a gun safe has to mean. There is no referee. When a box says 60 minutes at 1200 degrees, that number came out of the same building that needs you to buy the box. The manufacturer picks the oven temperature. The manufacturer picks how long. The manufacturer decides where inside the safe to hang the thermometer and what counts as passing. Then the manufacturer prints the result on the door and ships it. The people who make gun safes have said this out loud. One of the better-known storage companies flat out states these fire ratings are created by the manufacturers with no oversight, each one running its own private system. Another reviewer, a guy who's torn into more of these boxes than anyone alive, put it just as plainly. The companies make up their own fire test procedures, and whether they self-test or hire an outside shop to do it, both are equally suspect. Now, I want to be careful here, because there's a lazy version of this that's just wrong. Self-declared does not mean never tested. Some of these companies run a real burn. They put a real safe in a real oven and watch a real thermometer climb. What they didn't do is pay an independent lab to run the standardized test and certify the result in front of a witness. So the number might be honest. It might reflect something that really happened on a real bad afternoon in a test facility. You just have no way to know because the only party who saw the test is the party selling you the outcome. That's the trap, and it's a quiet one. It isn't that every number is a lie. It's that you cannot tell the honest numbers from the invented ones, because not one of them had anyone in the room who wasn't on the payroll. There is a real test. It exists, and it is brutal, which is exactly why you almost never see it on a gun safe you can afford. It's called UL-72, and the thing it measures is not the outside of the box. It's the temperature inside, where your rifles and your glass actually live. And it doesn't just measure one thing. There are classes. The one built around paper keeps the inside under 350 degrees, because that's roughly where paper starts to char. There's a stricter class for magnetic media that holds the inside under 150 degrees and controls the humidity, because tape cooks long before paper does. There's a stricter one still for digital media, under 125. Your guns care about the paper number, but I want you to see that the real standard is precise about what it's protecting and how hot the inside is allowed to get. The made-up number on the door is precise about nothing. It's a duration and a temperature, with no class behind it and no floor on what happens to the inside. Here's the part that truly separates the real test from the factory burn. In the UL test, the oven gets hotter the longer it runs. Half an hour in, it's already past 1500 degrees. Push it to a couple of hours, and it climbs past 1800, and at the long end, it's brushing 2000. The test gets harder as it goes, not easier, and it doesn't end when they switch the oven off, because a steel box keeps drinking in heat after the flames are gone. That cool-down soak is where a lot of designs quietly fail. The inside, creeping past the limit, an hour after the fire's technically out. Run the full thing, and the test can eat the better part of a day. Compare that to a factory burn that tops out at 1200 degrees, the temperature that happens to be the friendliest to a passing result, held flat, ended early, thermometer wherever they like. Same sounding number on the door, 2 completely different events behind it. So why doesn't every company just get the real stamp? 2 reasons, and neither one is a secret. The first is that the drywall-and-sheet-steel build most consumer gun safes use would not survive the UL burn, so they don't enter it. The reviewer I mentioned tracked it down. Over the entire history of the standard, essentially one gun safe built with ordinary gypsum board ever passed UL 72, an older model that got a 30-minute paper class and then got discontinued inside of a year. That's the company you'd be keeping if you demanded the real stamp. The second reason is money. Running a UL 72 test reportedly costs somewhere around $60,000 per model, plus sacrificial safes for the burn, plus a retest down the road. On a box you're trying to sell for $600. Nobody's spending that, so they don't. They run their own gentler burn and print that instead, and the certificate that would have cost them 60 grand gets replaced by a decal that cost them nothing. There's a middle ground I owe you, because a handful of companies do better than a bare sticker, and I won't lump them in with the worst of it. There's an independent lab, Intertech, it wears the ETL mark, that will run a fire test and put its own name on the result. That's real third-party testing. It's audited by someone who is not selling you the safe. It's just a milder burn than the full UL standard, usually capped at that 1200-degree ceiling rather than the 1500 and climbing the UL test ramps to. One of the big American safe makers uses exactly that lab and says so, and describes its burn as consistent with the UL method even though it runs cooler. That's a company testing for real and being straight about the level. So there's a ladder here, 3 rungs, and you need to see all 3. Top rung, an independent UL fire rating, which on a long gun safe a working hunter can afford, is close to a unicorn. Middle rung, a real test by an outside lab like Intertech, milder, but witnessed and named. Bottom rung, a number the factory made up, which might be honest and might be a guess sprayed onto a decal, and you will never be able to tell which. The villain in this whole story is not the box that sits honestly on the middle rung and tells you so. The villain is the box on the bottom rung wearing a coat of paint that makes your eye put it on the top. And this is where 3 letters do more heavy lifting than any sheet of steel in the building. Let me show you exactly how it happens, using the single most popular fire safe under $1,000. I sold a wall of them, so I know this listing cold. The page says UL rated fireboard. It says UL listed lock. It says a proven 45-minute fire rating at 1400 degrees. Read those 3 phrases slowly, because here's the thing that'll bother you once you catch it. Every single one of them is true, and stacked on top of each other they build an impression that is not. The fireboard is UL rated. The sheet of fire-resistant material, evaluated as a material, meets a UL spec. The lock is UL listed. The lock. Neither of those is a UL fire test of the safe, and the 45-minute fire number is the company's own, sitting right there in the same paragraph, borrowing the glow. By the time that listing reaches some retailer's product page, I have watched that number turn into the words, independently verified by UL. 3 letters that started their life on a panel of fireboard and an electronic lock, now quietly standing in the doorway of the entire box. Nobody had to lie to get there. Your eye does the assembling. UL lands on the page, your brain grabs it, and it staples the mark to the biggest promise in sight. I'm not telling you that particular safe will fail in a fire. I have no idea, and neither does anyone who didn't witness a test. I'm telling you the UL on it is describing a board and a lock, and the fire number beside it is the house's own word, and those 2 things are wearing the same jacket on purpose. Once you see that seam, you can't unsee it. You'll catch it on half the boxes on the showroom floor, so that's the first claim the fire won. Now the second, and it's the one that costs people the most, because it hides inside a single word you'd never think to question. Safe. Here's what that word means on most of these products, in the fine print, if it means anything measurable at all. The certification underneath it is usually something called an RSC, a residential security container. That's a real UL standard, it has a number, and I want you to hear exactly what earning the base level takes. 1 technician, common hand tools, a pry bar, a hammer under 3 pounds, a screwdriver, a chisel, a small drill, 5 minutes of working time against the box. If, at the end of 5 minutes, that one person hasn't made a 6-inch opening, the box passes and gets to wear the rating. That is the entire test that lets a product carry the word safe. 5 minutes, 1 person, no power tools, no grinders, no carbide. A few years back, they revised the standard and added tougher tiers on top of the base. A second level that brings in a second technician, 10 minutes, and more aggressive bits. And a third level that's stricter still. Almost nothing you'll see on a shelf carries the higher levels. The box in the ad is wearing the 5-minute rating, and the 5-minute rating is doing a lot of quiet work. And that clock only runs while the tool is actually touching the metal. They call it networking time. So 5 minutes on the certificate is not 5 minutes of a real break-in with a guy resting and repositioning. It's 5 minutes of pure contact. The rest of the villain is in the steel, and this is where the numbers get almost funny. To even qualify as a container, the body is supposed to be 12-gauge steel or thicker. 12-gauge is about 1/10 of an inch. Plenty of the cheaper boxes run 14-gauge on the body. That's around 7/100ths of an inch, noticeably thinner than the standard zone floor, and a 12-gauge measures out nearly 3 times as strong as a 14. They pass anyway by hanging a beefier door on the front and letting the door carry the certificate. So you're looking at a thick, impressive door bolted onto walls you could work through with tools from any hardware store. I've watched it happen. One of those storage companies I mentioned earlier admitted out loud and in public that it cut most of the way through the side of a certified box in a matter of minutes with a cheap saw off the discount tool rack. A safe cracker on video peeled the body of a big box store safe open in about 10 minutes, just by deforming it with a pry bar. I'm not going to teach you the how. That is not the point of this video, and it's not what this channel does. The point is that the word safe is carrying a promise the standard behind it never made, because there is a real safe. There's a whole separate UL standard for the thing you picture when you hear the word, a burglary rating called TL15 and TL30. That's a wall equivalent to a full inch of solid steel. That's steel with a minimum strength spec, so it can't just be soft and thick. That's a box that has to weigh at least 3/4 of a ton or be anchored down. That's a test where 2 people come at it for a full 15 or 30 minutes with power tools, carbide drills, grinders, and abrasive saws. Every single tool the RSC test specifically forbids. The gap between a TL30 and an RSC is not a step up. It's a canyon. And the marketing word, safe, floats over both sides of that canyon like they're the same country. Even the companies making these will concede it if you catch them being straight. The people who know the standards will tell you flat out that a gun safe isn't a safe. It's a security container. The word on the box and the word in the standard are not the same word. That's the whole trick, and it's a good one, because it never feels like a trick. It feels like plain common sense. You see a heavy steel box with a digital keypad and a fire number and the word safe. And every instinct you've got agrees that your rifles are protected. The box didn't have to break a single law to walk you there. So let me put the whole thing in one sentence, because this is the machine under everything I've told you. The gun safe industry sells you a feeling with 2 words and 2 letters. Fireproof. A number the seller wrote and nobody checked. Safe. A container that only has to survive 5 minutes against one guy with hand tools. And UL, a mark that's often describing a board or a lock, standing in the doorway of your whole collection while your eye hangs it on the steel. The box on your floor isn't broken. It's telling you a story. And you paid extra for the story. If this is the first time anyone's laid that out for you straight, that's the entire reason this channel exists. No sponsors, no affiliate links, nothing to sell you but a clearer look at what you already own. Subscribe and I'll keep pulling the labels off the gear the counter won't. Now here's the part I actually owe you, because tearing something apart and walking away is the cheap move. What do you do with all this? How do you buy well? Because you can, and it does not take $3,000. Start with the 2 things a company physically cannot fake: weight and steel. They can print any fire number they dream up, and they can call anything a safe, but they cannot lie about what the thing weighs when it's sitting on the freight scale, and they cannot hide the gauge if you make them tell you. Heavier is real protection you can feel. Here's a fact that'll save you money. A cheap RSC and an expensive RSC often protect you about the same, because the burglary rating behind both is the identical 5-minute test. The reviewer who tests these for a living says it outright. There's very little real difference in protection between a $500 RSC and a $10,000 one. A lot of what you're paying for on the expensive box is gloss paint, a plush interior, chrome, and a badge, not steel and not survival. So put your money into gauge and mass, not trim. 10 gauge body or thicker if you can swing it. 14 gauge is the floor, and it's a floor I'd only stand on for keeping a box out of a kid's hands, not for stopping somebody who showed up to work. Second, make the certification name a witness, not a decoration. For fire, the gold word is UL, but you have to check what it's bolted to. UL on the fireboard and UL on the lock is not UL on the fire rating. If you cannot find a fire test run by an outside lab, a real UL fire class, or at the very least an Intertech ETL burn with the temperature stated in plain numbers, then treat that fire number as the manufacturer's opinion and price it like one. It might be a fine opinion. It's still just an opinion until a witness signs it. For break-in, look for UL RSC at the bare minimum, and if you can find one of the newer, tougher RSC levels that adds a second person and real drilling time, that's a genuine upgrade worth paying for. Match the certificate to the claim on the front of the box. If the big word on the front doesn't have an outside name standing behind it, the front is just marketing with a keypad. Third, and this one costs you nothing, bolt the thing to the floor. Every one of these safes ships with pre-drilled holes, and most people never use them. An unanchored safe is not a safe that resists a break-in. It's a safe that rides out in the bed of a pickup and gets opened at somebody's leisure in a garage 3 counties over. The strongest box on earth is a lockbox on wheels if it isn't fastened down. And here's the honest other side, because I am not here to scare you into a vault you don't need. A cheap RSC, bolted down, still does real jobs, and I won't pretend otherwise. It stops the smash and grab guy who's got 8 minutes in your house and no tools in his hands. And that's what most burglaries are. It keeps firearms away from a curious kid, which for a lot of you is the single most important thing the box will ever do. And it satisfies the storage laws a growing number of states now put on you. There's even a real argument for the drywall fire build, that gypsum board genuinely does soak up heat, because the water chemically locked inside it turns to steam and holds the temperature down for a while. In a clean oven test, it works. The knock isn't that it does nothing. The knock is that nobody outside the factory checked how long, and that the same board can sweat moisture and corrode your rifles over the years it sits there quietly. Not every hunter needs a TL-30. A guy with 4 rifles and a shotgun in a suburb is not in the same threat model as a collector in a rural county with a wall of glass and a volunteer fire department 40 minutes out. The RSC is not the villain for existing. The RSC is the villain the moment it's dressed up and priced as the thing it plainly isn't. Which brings this all the way back to you specifically, because you are the exact person these labels were written to catch. Think about what's sitting in your box. It isn't cash. It's long guns, and half of them wear glass that cost as much as the rifle underneath it. And optics do not survive a fire. They melt into the rail. It's a season's worth of ammunition that turns into a real hazard when a box fails, because rounds cook off once the inside climbs past their threshold. It's the kind of collection that took 15 years to build and can't be rebuilt with a phone call and a claim number. And a lot of you keep it out at a camp or a rural place where, when it goes bad, the fire department is a long gravel drive and a longer response time away, which is the one scenario where a real fire rating would have mattered most, and where a made-up one lets you down the hardest. The companies are not confused about any of this. They aim these boxes straight at you. The best-selling budget line gets marketed for the hunting cabin by name. There's a whole product family named for the hunter. They know exactly who's standing at the counter. They are counting on you reading fireproof and safe, nodding and stopping there. One more thing worth checking, and I'll say plainly, this is not insurance advice. Go read your own policy with your own eyes. But most standard homeowners' policies cap what they'll pay on stolen guns at a surprisingly low number, often around $2,500 for the entire collection, no matter what it's really worth. If your safe full of rifles walks out the door, that cap is the wall between you and the loss. To cover the real value, you usually need a separate scheduled rider, priced at a small percentage of the collection every year, and some of those policies want to see an actual qualifying safe before they'll write it. There are firearm-specific policies out there too, some endorsed by the big shooting organizations, that'll cover a serious chunk of replacement value for not much a year. The point isn't which one you pick. The point is that the guy who trusted the word safe to satisfy his insurer might find out on the single worst day of his life that the word on his box and the word in his policy were never the same word either. So here's where we started, and here's where you're standing now. The fire number on your safe was written by the people who sold it to you. The word safe was chosen by the people who sold it to you. And the letters UL, half the time, are quietly describing a board and a lock while your eye drapes them over the whole box. None of that is against the law. All of it is a story. The only thing that's changed in the last 20 minutes is that you can read it now. You can walk into that store, look past the paint and the number and the word on the front panel, and ask the 3 questions that actually decide whether you're protected. What does it weigh? What's the gauge? And whose name, other than the seller's, is standing behind the test? If the answer to that last one is nobody, then you've finally priced the story correctly. It's worth 0. I did a whole teardown on another empty certification. A lot of you are trusting with something more precious than rifles. The safety rating stamped on tree stands and who actually checks it before you hang 30 feet up on it. Same machine, different sticker. That one's next if you want it. Until then, weigh the box, read the seam, and bolt it down.